A homeless man stopped JD Vance on the street, his voice barely cutting through the hum of downtown Cincinnati. "Hey man, can you spare $1?" It was a simple request, one JD had heard countless times before. Most people would have kept walking. Maybe, with a polite shake of the head, maybe without even acknowledging the man at all. But something about him made JD pause. Maybe it was the way his voice wavered, or how he didn't immediately make eye contact, as if already bracing for rejection. JD turned to him. "What's your name?" The man hesitated, caught off guard. This wasn't how these encounters usually went. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Eddie." Eddie was thin, not just in the way that came from missing a few meals, but in the way that time and hardship carve into a person. His clothes, mismatched layers thrown together for warmth rather than style, told a silent story of survival. His hands, cracked from the cold, remained buried in his jacket pockets. "You live around here?" JD asked. Eddie let out a short laugh, humorless. "I live wherever I can, you know how it is." JD nodded. He could feel the weight of a few curious eyes on them now. People passing by, some pretending not to listen, others not even bothering to hide their interest. But he wasn't focused on them. He was focused on Eddie. "How long have you been out here?" Eddie shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the street like he was debating whether to keep talking or just walk away. "Too long," he finally said. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city moved around them, cars rolling past, pedestrians, lost in their own worlds. But JD stood still. Eddie sighed. "I just need $1, man." This time his voice was quieter, almost as if he was lowering the price of his own request. JD didn't reach for his wallet. Instead, he met Eddie's eyes. "What would you do with it?" And that's when everything changed. Eddie let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a scoff. "Ain't that the question?" But JD Vance didn't smile. He wasn't joking. Eddie's expression shifted, his jaw tightening slightly. $1 don't get you much these days," he muttered. "Maybe a coffee, maybe a piece of bread if you know where to go." He hesitated, then added quieter, "Or maybe just a moment where I don't feel like nothing." The words hung between them, heavy. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't begging. He was just telling the truth. Vance's eyes flicked to Eddie's hands, still buried deep in his jacket pockets, fingers fidgeting as if trying to hold on to something invisible. "You used to work?" Vance asked. Eddie huffed another laugh, this one colder, tinged with bitterness. "Yeah, before life got in the way." Vance nodded. "What was the job?" Eddie hesitated, then shrugged. "Plumber. Not the fancy kind. Residential. Work mostly. Fixed leaks, replaced busted water heaters." He shook his head. "Ain't much demand for a guy who don't got a fixed address, though." Vance didn't argue. He'd heard stories like this before. Some people fell through the cracks so fast they barely had time to brace for impact. Eddie rubbed his chin, fingers brushing over uneven stubble. "So," he said, voice laced with expectation, "you gonna give me $1 or what?" Vance paused, then said something no one expected. "I'll give you something better." Eddie frowned. "Man, I ain't asking for a sermon." "It's not a sermon," Vance said calmly. Eddie studied him, weary. Around them, the usual street noise seemed to dull, as if the city itself was waiting to see what happened next. But whatever Vance had in mind, Eddie could tell it wasn't going to be simple. Shifting his weight, Eddie braced himself. Conversations like this usually ended with someone talking about personal responsibility, about pulling yourself up. He'd heard it all before, but Vance didn't launch into a speech. Instead, he asked, "When's the last time someone gave you a real shot?" Eddie blinked, caught off guard. "What, like a job?" "Like anything." Eddie exhaled, looking past Vance as if searching the skyline for an answer. After a moment, he shook his head. "Been a while." Vance nodded like he already knew. "You ever try to get off the streets?" Eddie shot him a sharp look. "Man, what kind of question is that?" Vance didn't flinch. Eddie scoffed, running a rough hand over his face. You think I want to be out here? You think this is some kind of choice? Vance didn't interrupt. He just listened. I tried shelters, Eddie continued. Half of them full up before I even get in the door. Tried work. You know what? They tell me, come back when you got a phone. Come back when you got an address. He let out a humorless chuckle, like I could pull that out of thin air. Vance crossed his arms, still listening. Eddie eyed him. You ever been homeless? Vance shook his head. No. Eddie smirked. Yeah. Didn't think so, but I've been poor, Vance said. Something in Eddie's face shifted, still skeptical but maybe a little less dismissive. Yeah? Vance nodded. Grew up in a house where sometimes the heat didn't work, where the fridge was mostly empty. I know what it's like to go to school wearing the same clothes 2-3 days in a row. Eddie sniffed, rubbing his nose with the back of his hand. Yeah, well, bet you had a way out. A way. Vance met his gaze. Took a while. Silence stretched between them. Around them the crowd had grown. People lingering, watching. A man in a baseball cap held up his phone, pretending to check messages but clearly recording. A woman whispered to her friend, eyes flicking between Vance and Eddie. Eddie exhaled sharply. So what? You gonna tell me to work harder? To just want it more? Vance shook his head. No. Eddie narrowed his eyes. Then what? Vance reached into his jacket pocket, but instead of money, he pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He held it out. Eddie eyed it suspiciously. What's that? A name. A number. Eddie didn't take it. For what? Someone who can help. Eddie scoffed. Help how? They run a program. Housing first. No strings. Eddie laughed, shaking his head. Yeah, right, ain't that easy? But Vance didn't lower his hand. No, it's not, Vance said. But it's real. Eddie hesitated. He'd heard words like this before. Been handed flyers for shelters that were already full. Numbers for programs with waiting lists months long. He'd been promised help that never came. Was this any different? He wasn't sure, but there was something about the way Vance looked at him. He wasn't smiling, wasn't selling anything. Why are you doing this? Eddie asked. Vance's answer was simple. Because someone once did it for me. Eddie swallowed, his eyes darting between Vance and the paper in his hand. But he wasn't the only one watching, and not everyone agreed with what was happening. The folded paper in Vance's hand looked like a loaded question. Eddie had seen plenty of handouts before, worn-out flyers for soup kitchens, business cards from social workers who never picked up, pamphlets from churches offering prayers instead of solutions. But something about this moment felt different. Finally, Eddie reached out and took the paper, though not without a skeptical glance. His rough fingers unfolded it, hands unsteady from the cold. The name inside meant nothing to him. The number didn't either. It could have been real. Or just another dead end. He exhaled sharply through his nose. So that's it? He looked up. No dollar. A few people in the crowd scoffed. Someone muttered under their breath. The man in the baseball cap adjusted his phone, still recording. Vance stayed calm. Would $1 really help? Eddie let out a bitter chuckle. Wouldn't hurt. Wouldn't change anything either, Vance said. Eddie clenched his jaw. Man, I ain't asking you to save me. Just asked for a damn $1. More murmurs from the crowd. A woman off to the side shook her head, muttering, Just give him the money, man. Vance ignored them. His focus was on Eddie. You said you worked before. Plumbing, right? Eddie exhaled hard. Yeah. What about it? Vance pulled out his phone. There's a guy I know. Runs a contracting business out of Dayton. He's always looking. For workers. He'll take a chance on people who need a second shot. Eddie squinted. You serious? Vance nodded. I make the call. You show up, you work, you get paid. No games. The crowd stirred. A teenager in a hoodie whispered something to his friend. A man near the curb, who had been silent until now, shook his head and muttered, Politicians, man. Always a stunt. Eddie let out a dry laugh. So let me get this straight. I ask for $1 and you're trying to give me a job? Vance's expression didn't change. I'm trying to give you a way out. Eddie gripped the paper tighter. He could feel every eye on him, waiting to see what he'd do. Take the offer, or tell Vance to go to hell? Someone in the crowd finally snapped. This some kind of joke? The voice came from a man near the curb, grocery bag slung over his arm. His face was lined with skepticism, his mouth curled in disbelief. He didn't ask for a job interview, the man continued. He asked for a damn $1, a cup of coffee. You really think a dude living on the streets can just show up to a job like that? A few people murmured in agreement. Vance didn't look away from Eddie. You tell me. Eddie's mouth felt dry. His fingers twitched at his sides. He'd been stuck in this life for so long, he wasn't sure if he even knew how to want something different anymore. The paper burned in his hand. And then, he did something no one expected. Eddie's fingers curled around it. Not like it was a lifeline. Not like it was a trick. Like it was something fragile. Something he wasn't sure belonged to him. His breath felt heavy in his chest. A job. A real shot. Not $1. Not a pity-filled pat on the shoulder. Something bigger. And yet the weight of all those eyes made his skin itch. He could feel the judgment rolling off them, the people who weren't homeless, the ones who had warm beds to go back to. You gonna take it or what? The man with the grocery bag again. His voice sharp with something between disbelief and irritation. Eddie shot him a glare. What's it to you? The man scoffed, shifting the weight of his bag. What's it to me? I've seen guys like you 100 times, always an excuse. Always a reason why something ain't good enough. Eddie's jaw clenched. Man, you don't know a damn thing about me. The guy laughed dryly. I know you ain't worked in years. I know you're out here begging instead of trying. And I know you ain't about to take that offer. The man shook his head. And if you do, you'll quit the second it gets hard. The words hit harder than Eddie wanted to admit. His grip on the paper tightened. He wanted to tell the guy to shove, it to say he didn't know what the hell he was talking about. But the truth was, a small part of Eddie wondered the same thing. Did he still have it in him? Could he wake up at 5 a.m., push through exhaustion, show up, and prove himself? And then there was the other side of it, the part that whispered, what? If this is just another lie? He turned back to Vance, eyes filled with something unreadable. And what happens if this is bullshit? Eddie asked. If I show up and they ain't got nothing for me? Vance didn't blink. Then you call me. Eddie narrowed his eyes. Call you? Vance nodded and held up his phone. I don't give people my number lightly, but if you show up and they don't give you work, you call me, and I'll find you something else. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The teenager in the hoodie whispered, Yo, is this real? To his friend. The man with the grocery bag scoffed, but didn't say anything this time. Eddie's heart pounded. It was too much. Too real. He'd spent so long being ignored, avoided, treated like he didn't exist. Now, here was someone offering him something real, a job, a lifeline, and that scared the hell out of him. He swallowed hard. I don't even got a phone. Vance didn't hesitate. Reaching into his coat pocket, he pulled out a small black burner phone and held it out. Now you do. The crowd went dead silent. A few gasps, someone muttered, No way. Eddie stared at the phone like it was a foreign object, his breathing uneven. No one had ever done something like this for him before. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get any more intense, a voice from the crowd cut through like a blade. This is all for show. Eddie's grip on the phone tightened. His heart, which had been pounding with something close to hope, clenched at the accusation. The man who spoke was older, mid-50s maybe. Salt and pepper beard, a flannel shirt worn thin, arms crossed. Face, hard. This some kind of political stunt? The man asked, voice laced with suspicion. Cameras are rolling, people watching, and suddenly you're out here saving a homeless man? What happens when they stop watching? Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Some nodded. Others looked uncertain. Vance met the man's stare without flinching. "You think I did this for attention?" The man scoffed. "Ain't that what politicians do?" Eddie glanced between them, something twisting in his gut. He didn't want to believe this was fake. Didn't want to think he was just another pawn in someone else's story. But doubt, so familiar, so deeply ingrained, crept back in. Vance didn't raise his voice. Didn't try to defend himself with flashy words. He simply said, "What I did today doesn't change just because people are watching. If you think it does, that says more about the world you've seen than it does about me." The man in the flannel didn't respond right away. He just shook his head, muttered something under his breath, and walked off. A woman in the crowd spoke next. "So, what happens now?" Eddie blinked, realizing the question was aimed at him. His chest felt tight. He had the phone. He had the number. He had the chance. But was he really going to take it? He licked his lips, glancing down at the burner phone one more time before stuffing it into his pocket. "Guess I make a call," he muttered. It was the smallest commitment he could make, just a call. Just a first step. Vance nodded. "That's all you gotta do." Eddie shifted his weight. "And if I screw it up, you try again." Eddie let out a slow breath. He didn't know if this would change his life. Didn't know if this was another false hope or the real thing. But for the first time in a long time, he had something, a name, a number, a phone, and maybe, just maybe, a second chance. Vance stepped back, giving him space, no pressure, no theatrics, just a simple truth left hanging in the air. Somewhere in the crowd, a phone camera clicked off. A few people walked away, shaking their heads, still debating whether what they had just witnessed was real. But for Eddie, it didn't matter what they thought. This wasn't about them. It was about whether or not he was ready to fight for himself again. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and walked away. This time, with something in his pocket that wasn't just another empty promise. Not every opportunity comes in the form we expect. Some don't come at all. But when they do, when someone reaches out and says, "I see you," the hardest part isn't taking the help. It's believing you deserve it. Maybe Eddie makes that call. Maybe he doesn't. But this story isn't about a guaranteed outcome. It's about what happens when we stop assuming people are beyond saving and start treating them like they still matter.